Hello, I'm Jim Schaefer, the executive producer and host of Rip Rap, the academic book television program. Our guest today is Kristin, the author of Carried to the Wall, American Memory in the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. This was quite a difficult book. Intriguing but difficult, and but it has some additional relevance or depth or dimension because of these new things that are happening about what I call shrine building and memorials. There was the thing with JFK Jr. when he died, and Princess Di. And so this all kind of came out when you started talking about the construction of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial.
Yeah, I think that new American memorial practices started at, public memorial practices started at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, and they've been contagious. And I think the way in which people figured out how to mourn the particular, the whole range of griefs that people had to mourn about the Vietnam War, have taught people how to mourn publicly together since. I mean, I think the first, Princess Di is, she's a little bit of a different case because she's obviously in England, and there, but I think the John F. Kennedy mourning, all of the mourning for him is very interesting and very connected. The first example, the most obvious example of the way in which people have learned from the way people grieve at the wall is the Oklahoma City bombing site. And that to me is incredible. I mean, the people began to bring objects to the wall in 1982 when it was first built, and they sort of brought them one at a time, very steady but slowly at first. And in Oklahoma City, 10 years after the completion of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, the day of the bombing, people started to bring things. I mean, people brought objects, people brought their own memorials to the site literally before the dust had begun to settle, and within a year there were 1 million objects, which is many, many more than have been brought to the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. And then when John Kennedy died, whenever there's some kind of big shared public grief, people come to the site and they bring their things, which for me is interesting in a whole bunch of ways. I mean, one of the ways it is interesting is in that people choose to mourn with objects. For me, that's very compelling. And another way is, in which it's interesting to me, is that people are choosing to mourn publicly together, and they feel that it's appropriate for them to do so. I mean, in the age of television culture, in the age in which so much of what's public is dictated by, the large corporations that produce the television and that produce the newspapers and sort of dictate or at least guide a lot of what's happening in the culture, and memorials are, as they have always been, official memorials are built by memorial commissions, and they go through all this red tape, that there are so many people who feel that it's their job and it's their duty and it's their responsibility to sort of step aside, put all that aside, and make these public monuments themselves. Is incredible to me.
Well, that was interesting, as you point out in the book, that there's always been some kind of place markers or war memorials, but they were decided by the overall entity, the government. I mean, it goes all the way back, you point out in the book, to the Egyptians and the Romans and the Greeks.
Right. Recognizing an individual soldier in a memorial or even with a gravesite dates back only to the second half of the 19th century. I mean, at Gettysburg, as I argue in the book, Gettysburg is the first site at which individual soldiers were buried, which to us, we're so, now we have, there is no Vietnam veteran, there is no soldier in the unknown soul tomb for Vietnam veterans, because we have every piece of DNA of every soldier. We're so focused on the bodies of the soldiers now that it seems almost incomprehensible that, 130 years ago, there was no practice of burying individual soldiers. But that's in fact the case. And I think there's a connection between, as I argue in the book, there's a real strong connection between paying attention to the particular lives and the loss of particular lives of soldiers, and this impulse to bring a photograph to, or a teddy bear to John F. Kennedy's Jr.'s house in Tribeca. And I think the connection comes between, I think the connection is about people feeling like they have a real stake in public life. And on the one hand, all of this stuff, as you say, it's very difficult writing this book, spending a lot of time at the wall, going to the warehouse where all this stuff is stored. It's tremendously difficult. I reading the stories of the families and looking at all these objects, I wept and wept as I started to do my research. But the further I got into it, the more joy I felt in all of it, because I really felt like, and I say this at the very end of the book, I say all of this stuff is so potentially sad and there's so much tragedy here, but there's this tremendous optimism, I feel, in the impulse that people have to respond to these tragedies themselves, that people aren't alienated, that they don't, at the wall, that people don't feel like, despite their shattered patriotism, like they don't feel that they don't have a voice. In fact, they feel very strongly that they do. So in this incredibly unprecedented way, people make the memorial, continue to make it their own every day.
They talk about a living memorial.
Yeah, it is. And the objects that people bring are, they are individual memorials, and together they make an incredible memorial. I think the design of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial itself is stunning. I think Madeline is amazing, and I think what she did there is truly incredible, and it's definitely part of this whole, she's definitely in part responsible for this new memorial practice, because she really evoked in people a very profound response. You go to the wall and, the Lincoln Memorial is full of kids, running around, and their voices are echoing across, off the walls. But at the wall, people are quiet. People show their respect to Lincoln, but it's different. At the wall, there is a sense, even the little kids, are hushed. And she created a very reverent place, which is very hard to do.
It was an interesting thing, too, of how the whole impetus happened to build the memorial. It wasn't some governmental commission saying, oh, well, that's a good thing to do.
Right.
In fact, that's something they struggle with in the doing of it.
Absolutely. It's a great story. In 1979, Jan Scruggs, who's a veteran, son of a milkman from Maryland, working class guy, the kind of guy who, from watching movies about World War II and from talking to people in his community, would assume that a good soldier like him could come back and kind of inherit the nation, that he would have, by serving his country valiantly, earned something, and instead he came back and there was not much for him to inherit except a lot of disrespect. And he went one night to watch the movie The Deer Hunter, which is an incredible movie and a difficult movie, and a movie about the experience of fighting in the war, but mostly a movie about what happened to communities in the wake of the problems that the war posed to patriotism. So he watched this movie, and he had this, as he tells the story in his book, a wonderful book called To Heal a Nation. He came home and he had this kind of moment, this sort of not quite the cliche kind of Vietnam veteran flashback, but he had this moment in which he thought, oh my God, what's happened to me? What's happened to my community? Something is really wrong. And he sort of struck the note of a wound that needed to be healed, and that's sort of how he saw it, and he decided that he was going to build this memorial. And unlike other memorial efforts, he didn't want, as you say, he didn't want the federal commissions involved. He really, the people that he was able to draw into this effort to build the memorial, they called themselves the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund. And they really were interested in doing this without the powers that be. They wanted it to be on the Mall in Washington because they wanted it to be a national memorial, but they didn't want the generation that sent them to fight in the war to have to decide how the war was going to be remembered. So they, in the story, they, in the beginning, they held a big press conference, and these are guys, they hardly ever wore a tie, maybe they had one suit, and they sort of, as they tell the story, and they held a press conference, and not very many people came. It was sort of a wash, and they realized that number one, in 1979, the Vietnam War was still, it was 4 years since the fall of Saigon, still very unpopular. The idea of celebrating somehow the soldiers who fought, for most Americans, was still fairly repugnant. If for, for some because they had so opposed the war, and the idea of celebrating it at all, and for some, the idea of just even bringing up the topic of the war was so.
It was very raw.
distasteful.
Yeah.
So, but they, eventually they got a couple of senators. They were close to Washington, so they pulled in a few, John Warner and various people, and eventually they made some headway. They put together a contest. My favorite story about the design contest is that it was a juried contest, and it was blind, so they had, I think, 1,400 submissions. All these people submitting designs for the memorial, and the judges went through and they looked at all of the designs, and apparently it was a unanimous decision, and immediately the design that Lynn had submitted, which was very rough, and they assumed that it was rough as an aesthetic choice, that this sort of aged master had sort of was sort of showing them this sort of not childlike, but definitely rough submission as kind of an aesthetic nod toward the sort of importance of the abstraction and all this stuff. And their comments were sort of, he's a genius, blah blah. And they had no idea there was a 19-year-old girl who was a student at Yale who had submitted it because her professor had encouraged everybody in her memorial architecture class to submit the design.
There was quite a controversy over that.
Oh, and then it was hugely controversial because it's not celebratory, it's not heroic. Her design, for people who haven't seen it, it's a black granite V that cuts into the ground, so that as you enter the memorial, the granite into which the names of all of the 58,000+ soldiers who were killed in the war are carved into the wall. And as you enter the memorial, it starts at about ankle high, and as you go further into the V, you get deeper and deeper and deeper. You're actually going down into the ground, so that when you're at the center of the memorial, you're literally 6 feet under with all of these names. And of course, it's so brilliant because you're 6 feet under, but behind you is all this open space. And actually, as you look into the reflective granite, you can see the Washington Monument behind you. So it's a light-filled space. It's very powerful, but it's not heroic. In contrast, and she's smart, the contrast to the Washington Monument and the sort of all of the traditions of celebration in, big stone monuments like that reach to the sky.
Or someone on a horse or with a
Exactly,
sword or a
exactly.
rifle or a flag or something
Right.
like that.
She
She was responding to all of that, and she was countering it, and people hated it. And a lot of people, people on the left hated it, people on the right hated it, but more people on the right hated it. And the fund, the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund, ran into a lot of trouble with the Reagan administration because they weren't interested in a monument that wasn't manly or heroic. And James Watt sort of cut a deal with them and said, look, you can't have this design as it is. You have to add something. So they added the sculpture. There's this figural sculpture of 3 men, which I think has these sort of imperial overtones. There's a white guy in the middle, and he has his arms out like this, protecting African-American figure, and a figure who the sculptor says is racially ambiguous. So he could be Asian.
We always
could
need a
be
racially ambiguous
right,
person.
Right. So nobody's left out, although it's sort of ridiculous in my mind because, of course. But at any rate, he's sort of protecting these figures, and they have all their sort of war regalia on them. But what he's protecting them from, it's interesting as you look at it, because when the landscapers positioned the sculpture in relationship to the wall, what he's looking at and what he's protecting them from is actually the list of names on the memorial. And Maya Lin said the best thing about the way in which the controversy led to the addition of this sculpture, which she obviously was not in favor of. But she said, well, it's good because it memorializes the controversy, and it makes the way in which it was so difficult for people to come to any kind of particular memorial gesture about this war it makes it part of the memorial, and it will be part of the memorial forever.
One of the interesting words in this context is community. And that's the one that I had the most trouble understanding because there's all different kinds or parts of this community. There's the people who fought in the war, the people who protested against, the people who legislated for, and the people legislated against. There are the families, relatives, neighbors who were affected by what happened during the war, and then the aftermath when veterans came home or the protesters came home. Some had gone to Canada. Then there is the larger national community that was trying to deal with something that could not be taken aboard. It's still raw. I mean, if you talk about any part of this, there's still these huge passions. And then there's the international community of Vietnam and Asia and people in this country. And there's attempts now by Vietnam vets I've read where they've gone back to Vietnam to meet the people that they had been killing or had been partners with or married to or children there. So this whole issue of community is a very difficult topic.
Yeah, I thought about it a lot in terms of patriotism and kind of the way in which patriotism is about, it is one way for Americans to conceive of their sort of largest community. Because I think that one of the things that was so painful about the Vietnam War at home was the way in which it, for a lot of people, it really shattered their ideal of community. Week after week, month after month of realizing that, the government's not telling the truth. Watching on television and seeing the contradictions and knowing that people in, your community are sending their sons to fight this war and the government's not telling the truth. I mean, people's sense of the sort of national community, I really think, was chronically damaged by the way in which the war was waged and the cost of the war. But so you might imagine that there would be that you would feel sort of a loss of community at the memorial. But in fact, what you feel quite intensely is the desire to rebuild community. There's so much, there are all kinds of communities, as you said, there are different kinds of constituencies who feel very powerfully still about this and who are at the wall every day. There are the Vietnam veterans who are involved in the POW/MIA movement, for whom, and there are lots of people who are not Vietnam veterans who are involved in the POW/MIA movement. That's one kind of very tight, very particular, very explicit effort to form community. And then there are a lot of people who hang out at the wall who are Vietnam veterans who want to talk to other people, who they want to talk about their experience, they want to talk to people who were there with them, they want to talk to people who are curious, and they're sort of trying to form, and successfully I think, forming community. Then there are what the veterans that I've talked to at the wall call the wannabes. There are a lot of people who claim to be Vietnam veterans who, there are a lot of people who couldn't possibly have, they weren't born, who kind of put on the fatigues and they claim to be Vietnam veterans, which on one hand is funny, and on the other hand it's,
That's a little weird.
It's tragic. But I think there's a sense of loss that they share. And I think that's sort of what brings all these different communities together, is that everybody shares a sense of loss. At the 10th anniversary celebration, Jan Scruggs put on this festival, and it was remarkable in a number of ways. He's very explicit in his effort, and again, he's the guy who sort of started this whole impulse to build a memorial, and he's been the director of the Vietnam Veterans Memorial Fund from the beginning. But he made this very nice gesture at the beginning of the celebration anniversary. He said, everybody stop and introduce yourself. It was like church. Introduce yourself, peace be with you, to the person standing next to you. And it changed the public event in a way that was very profound, and everybody sort of shaking hands, and all the people, the people who look like they're wearing Gore-Tex now, but they were probably hippies, and the people who had sort of POW hats, earrings, scarves, T-shirts, sort of shaking hands, and throughout the event, there were people standing up saying, this war was, vile and unconscionable, and this memorial will teach everybody never to fight in another war, and everybody would applaud, and then there would be somebody who would stand up and say, I'm so proud that my dad fought in this war, and this war was a valiant effort, and everybody would applaud. I mean, there's more, what holds all of the impulses at the wall together, I think, is this incredible desire for community. And I think that in what we see at Oklahoma City and what we see in front of John Kennedy's apartment building in New York is also about community. It's about a sense of what we share.
There's a fascinating thing I've seen happen when people just need to touch the wall, touch the name.
Yeah.
And then part of that is to leaving something of theirs.
Yeah.
And you talk a lot about that, and also the relation to the scholarly issue of material culture. But there's this need to react.
Myelin, she wanted people to touch it, and she wanted people to take away rubbing. But nobody anticipated, which I think is a really important part of the memorial, that there's this tactile quality, and that you can take a name home with you. But nobody anticipated that people would bring their stuff. And people bring everything. I mean, they bring framed photographs, they bring crystal vases, they bring tennis shoes, they bring every kind of artifact, lots and lots of beer, probably more beer than anything else, except, I think sort of dog tags, beer, POW bracelets. Those are sort of some of the top items.
I remember one was a fruit cocktail.
Yeah.
Because it was in their rations, and so people who didn't know that missed the point, but that was something that was familiar to them.
Yeah, and you can imagine a person who, all you can do about these objects is conjecture. And I'm trying to imagine what was, and I think it's very interesting and useful to try and imagine, what was this person thinking, what do I share with these guys? I survived, they didn't, what can I give them?
What's the magnitude? You were talking about that in the book. It's just thousands and thousands of
thousands and
that are
thousands
being
of objects.
collected by the National Park.
The National Park Service twice a day.
Collects everything that's left, once in the morning and once in the evening usually. And they take them to a warehouse in suburban Maryland, and they save them. And eventually they hope to open a museum. But now they have a few exhibits here and there, but mostly there's so much stuff coming in, for curators. In a museum you get, in a big, month you get 2 objects, and they get, hundreds.
One of the touching things also are the messages left behind. And I wonder, you've got your book there. Can you find a couple of those and read them there at the beginning?
Yeah.
Because those I have them marked in this one.
Here's one. A lot of these notes, some of the notes I saw at the wall, and a lot of them I found in a great book called Shrapnel from the Heart by Laura Palmer. And she collects a lot of the letters that were left at the wall. And this is one, it reads, "My dearest Ben, I miss you and think of you so much. Every day in my prayers, I thank God and Jesus for caring for you and pray that will continue. I'm bringing teddy bear and a picture of your loved race car. I realize they can't stay here long, but they are yours, and I want them to be with you. In time, I hope we can all be together again. Love to you, my dear, dear Ben. Mama."
And then in a different hand, below that, "Much love, Dad." I love this one just because of the way in which, it's very rich. It's so tender, and the mother is able to sort of say all this and bring the teddy bear, and the father, "Much love." It's
the way in which emotion and gender gets played out of the wall. Right?
You also note in the book that often people would bring the funeral notice for that person and leave it.
Yeah, which I think is so interesting. Is the impulse, here you are, this is where you're buried, or is it, I said married because I'm thinking of a wife bringing this token and sort of like an advertisement. He has another place, or...
It seems almost like the presence in the memorial is a virtual reality that they then connect with the reality that they knew when that person was alive back in their local
setting. It's kind of an interesting phenomenon.
And I think for many people, the real memorial site is the wall rather than the individual, the grave site. And I think that's why, as I argue in the book, I think that's why the objects show up, because I think that the people that were asked to fight in this war called on traditions of grave decoration, and they brought those grave decoration traditions to the wall. And I think it's sort of a wonderful result of a terrible policy. But if you ask people who are far enough outside the corridors of power that they aren't represented in the Senate or the House or in the White House to fight in the war, you're gonna get something. And what we got in this case was their memorial practices really transforming the way in which all Americans mourn in public and mourn together and mourn these big national losses.
What's also interesting is that I think for the first time, the Vietnam veterans themselves had, well, you talked about flashbacks, but there's an element of this nonlinear process or fracturing of the psyche or something where there's, because of the trauma of all of this, where things happen that you don't intend. And so there's these juxtapositions of things that insert themselves into your life. And that's been one of the things that the veterans, they talk about that kind of traumatic syndrome, have had to live with. But then, actually, that's also been true of the nation, the people in this country at the same time. Things have happened, and it can't be looked at as World War II. It can't be looked at as neatly packaged up, put in a heroic, epic form, and easily played on some record or video or something like that.
I use the word liminal. I talk about the liminal status of the soldier, and I think it's a useful term because the way in which we have defined the nation often in the past is through our memories of the soldier. The definition of the soldier was completely disrupted. The definition of the soldier that had come to us through the Civil War and the First World War and the Second World War was completely disrupted by the way in which the Vietnam War was waged, by the way in which the sort of details of the system of rotation and the fighting, and the way that people felt about the war. So sort of these guys, they couldn't come home, these men and women couldn't come home and sort of assume the role of the heroic soldier. And that was painful for them, but as you say, it was painful for the whole nation.
The beginning of your title, Carry to the Wall, implies that the wall's like these new shrines. It's sort of a mecca, it's sort of a sacred place. It's something that people feel drawn to for some reason.
Yeah, I think that's very much true. I said before, people are hushed there.
It seemed to me, after reading the book and reflecting on it, that it's just going to be a long time before we all come to understand what happened.
Yeah.
But you've done a very nice job of it.
Thank you.
Thank you for being on the program.
It's been a pleasure.